October 8th, 1871, a Sunday evening. A barn on DeKoven Street. Nobody knows what started it. A lantern, a cow, a spark. 3 days later, 17,000 buildings were gone, a third of the city. 300 people dead. 100,000 on the streets with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The wooden sidewalks burnt first, 500 miles of them. Then the houses, then the downtown. Stone buildings that were supposed to be fireproof exploded in flames. The Chicago River couldn't stop it. The fire jumped across, twice. 500,000 people, 1 million coming in 5 years. The second largest city in America. 14 years, from ashes to empire. You know what they did the day after the fire ended? Started building. No time to mourn, no time to wait. Money doesn't sleep. They banned wood, new fire codes, everything in stone, brick, iron. If it could burn, it was illegal. Architects poured in, engineers, developers, land speculators bought entire blocks for pennies. Masons worked through winter, carpenters through snow. By 1872, a year after the fire, 10,000 new buildings stood where ruins had been. The city grew faster after the fire than before it. State Street, LaSalle Street, the heart of commerce, banks, offices, trading houses. The Chicago Board of Trade, where grain prices for the entire nation were set every morning. Men in top hats, horse-drawn carriages splashing through muddy streets, telegraph wires overhead humming with messages to New York, St. Louis, San Francisco. Everything moved fast here. Fortunes made in a season, lost in a day. Scaffolding still clung to half the buildings. The construction never stopped. Every month, a new block. Every year, a new neighborhood. But the real money wasn't in the stores. The Chicago River. Slow, brown, choked with barges. The Illinois and Michigan Canal opened in 1848. 96 miles of hand-dug waterway connecting Lake Michigan to the Illinois River, the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. Grain came down from Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, wheat, corn, barley. Massive grain elevators lined the riverbanks, steam-powered, the largest storage structures in the world. They could hold millions of bushels. By 1885, Chicago handled more grain than any port on earth. More than Liverpool, more than Odessa. The prairies fed through Chicago, and Chicago fed the cities. But grain was only half the story. The railroads made Chicago. By 1885, 12 major rail lines converged here. More track than anywhere in America. More trains, more freight, more passengers. You could stand at Union Depot and watch 50 locomotives arrive in a single hour. Passenger cars from New York, freight from California, cattle cars from Kansas. The noise was constant. Steam whistles, metal screeching, cargo being loaded, unloaded, transferred. Chicago was the crossroads. You couldn't go east to west without passing through. You couldn't ship anything across the country without Chicago taking its cut. And down those tracks came the animals. The Union Stockyards. Christmas Day, 1865. Opened in a blizzard. 1 square mile on the south side. Wooden pens stretching in every direction. 39th Street to 47th. Halsted to Ashland. By 1885, 9 million animals passed through every year. Cattle from Texas, hogs from Iowa, sheep from Montana. The trains rolled in. Workers unloaded them, drove them into pens, thousands at a time. The smell hit you miles away. Blood, manure, smoke from the rendering plants. 40,000 workers, Poles, Lithuanians, Germans, Irish, Bohemians, Italians. They lived in shacks nearby, back of the yards. Families crammed into wooden tenements. No running water, no sewers. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Wages so low they could barely eat. But they came, by the thousands, because this was work. This was America. Two men dominated it all. Philip Armour, meat-packing magnate, made his first fortune selling pork futures during the Civil War. Opened his plant in Chicago in 1867. Gustavus Swift, a butcher from Massachusetts, came to Chicago in 1875 with a single idea: the assembly line, the disassembly line. Armour's plant was 12 acres, the largest factory in the world. An animal entered alive at one end. An hour later, packaged meat came out the other. Nothing wasted. Hides became leather. Bones became fertilizer. Horns became buttons. Blood became glue. Everything but the squeal, they said. Efficiency, speed, volume. Henry Ford visited the stockyards in 1913, watched the line, went back to Detroit and built the same system for automobiles. The modern factory was born in a Chicago slaughterhouse. But Swift's real genius was the refrigerated rail car. Before 1875, you shipped animals live, loaded them on trains. Half died on the way. The rest arrived skinny, bruised, worthless. Swift put ice in rail cars, shipped dressed beef, fresh. Chicago meat in New York in 3 days, still cold, still sellable. The railroads hated it. They made more money shipping live animals. They refused to carry his cars. So Swift built his own. Then he built cold storage warehouses in every major city. Then he built a distribution network that bypassed the railroads entirely. By 1885, Swift and Armour controlled the meat supply of the entire East Coast. Hog butcher for the world. Carl Sandburg wrote that line 30 years later, but in 1885, it was already true. Back of the yards. Wooden shacks, dirt streets, open sewers. The workers lived here, the people who made the fortunes possible, the ones who stood in blood all day, who breathed the smoke, who lost fingers to the blades. Kids played in streets slick with offal. Women hung laundry that stank of rendering fat. The Chicago River downstream ran thick with waste. Bubbly Creek, they called it. The gases from rotting meat made it bubble. This was the price. This was the engine that powered the empire. Armour made millions. Swift made millions. The workers made enough to not starve. But the city kept growing. While they slaughtered animals in the south, new buildings rose downtown. Louis Sullivan, Daniel Burnham, John Root, architects who came for the rebuilding and stayed for the future. In 5 years, they'd build the first skyscrapers, 10 stories, steel frames, elevators. Chicago would invent the modern city, the vertical city. Stone replaced wood, steel replaced stone, ambition replaced limits. (1871). Fire consumed a third of the city. 1872, 500,000 people. 1873, 1 million. 20 years from ruins to the second city in America. They didn't rebuild Chicago. They built it better, stronger, taller, richer. From the ashes rose something the world had never seen. This is Chicago, phoenix from the ashes.